The air inside the farmhouse was thick with the smell of fresh bread and simmering chicken broth, a scent that should have meant comfort, but now clung to the back of Sarah's throat like a warning. Her hands were steady as she folded the laundry broadcloth shirts still warm from the afternoon sun, her movements automatic and precise. Through the open window, she could hear the rhythmic scrape of Jacob's plane against a length of oak in the workshop, a sound she had fallen asleep to for 6 years of marriage. It was the sound of provision, of a life being built plank by plank. She smoothed a crease in his Sunday shirt and allowed herself a small, private smile. In 3 days, the entire district would gather to raise the new barn for Bishop Miller, and Jacob had been asked to lead the framing crew. It was an honor that spoke of his standing, of their standing. A good life, a solid life, built on faith and hard work. The sound of the plane stopped. The silence that rushed in was different, heavy and sudden. It wasn't the pause of a man reaching for a ruler or sharpening a blade, it was a full stop. Sarah's hands paused on the fabric. She tilted her head, listening. A horse snorted in the near field. A blue jay scolded from the oak tree. Then, low and muffled, a sound that did not belong to the rhythm of the workshop. A soft, breathy laugh. A woman's laugh. It was a sound she knew as well as her own heartbeat, a laugh she had heard across 1,000 shared childhood secrets. It was her sister, Mary. The laundry slipped from her fingers and landed in a silent heap on the scrubbed pine floor. Her feet carried her across the kitchen, not with panic, but with the slow, deliberate trance of a dream. The screen door whispered open under her touch, and she stepped onto the back porch. The late afternoon sun was a golden blanket, but she felt a chill crawl up her arms. The workshop door was ajar, a black slash in the whitewashed clapboard. She walked across the packed dirt of the yard, each step a small, private eternity. The ground seemed to tilt slightly, the familiar world shifting on its axis. She reached the door and placed her palm against the rough, sun-warmed wood, pushing it open a few more inches. A sliver of light fell across the interior, illuminating a swirling galaxy of sawdust motes. And there, in the heart of that haze, stood Jacob. His suspenders were down, hanging limp against his work trousers. His hands, those strong, capable hands that had built her a hope chest and cradled their infant son, were cupping the face of a woman. The woman's back was to the door, but the navy blue dress and the white organdy prayer cap were unmistakable. The tilt of the head, the way her shoulders curved with a familiar, yielding softness. It was Mary. Jacob leaned in, and with a tenderness that shattered Sarah's entire world, he kissed her sister's lips. Sarah didn't scream, she didn't cry. The shock was a physical blow, a punch to the sternum that stole every molecule of air from her lungs. A single, strangled gasp escaped her, no louder than a bird hitting a window pane. But it was enough. Jacob's eyes, the color of a winter sky, snapped open and met hers over Mary's shoulder. In that instant, she saw not just guilt, but a flicker of something far more devastating before the mask of horror slammed down. It was recognition. The look of a man seeing the inevitable finally arrive. Mary whirled around, her own face a bloodless mask of terror. Her lips, the same shape as Sarah's, formed a silent no. Sarah didn't stay for the explanations that would be nothing but a second assault. She turned and walked back to the house. Her gait was measured, mechanical, each footstep placed carefully as if the earth were riddled with cracks. Behind her, she heard the frantic shuffle of bodies, the whispered hiss of her name, the sound of a heavy work boot scuffing on the threshold. She didn't look back. She entered the kitchen, the smell of the simmering broth now a sickening perfume. Her gaze fell on the jar of coins on the high shelf, the one they'd been saving for a new buggy. Beside it lay the old, worn hand plane that Jacob's father had brought with him from Lancaster County. It was a family heirloom, a symbol of their joined lineage. Her hand closed around the cool, heavy iron. It felt solid. It felt real. In a world that had just dissolved into a lie, it was the only true thing she could hold. The sound of weeping began, loud and desperate, from the direction of the workshop. It was Mary, a childlike wailing that Sarah had heard only once before, when a farm accident had taken their father from them. She could hear Jacob's low, urgent voice, a frantic murmur trying to quiet the storm. The screen door banged open and Mary stumbled through, her cap askew, her cheeks slick with tears. She stopped when she saw Sarah standing by the counter, the plane clutched in her fist. Sarah, please, Mary choked out, her hands wringing the fabric of her apron. Please, it wasn't, let me explain. Sarah turned her head slowly. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper of broken glass. Was ist let's, what is wrong? It was the question they asked in times of trouble, the community's way of gently probing a wound. But here, in this kitchen, it was a scalpel. Mary flinched. I am so sorry. We never meant for this. It happened. The words were the most pathetic, flimsy things Sarah had ever heard. They explained nothing. They were a smokescreen for a raging fire. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light. His face was ashen. Sarah, a word, a lone bit. Mary, still sobbing, fled up the stairs to the guest room, the room Sarah had so lovingly prepared for her sister's long visit to help with the canning. The door clicked shut, a muffled final sound. The kitchen was a held breath. Jacob took a step forward, his hands outstretched, a gesture of supplication. Mein Gott, Sarah, I have no words. I have failed you. I have failed God. He expected rage, perhaps. He was braced for it. But Sarah just stared at him, her mind a silent, screaming hurricane. She saw him, this man she had given her whole heart to, and he was a stranger. The kiss she had witnessed wasn't a fumble of passion. It was achingly gentle, a lover's kiss, a goodbye. That was the detail that gouged at her soul. It was the intimacy of a long familiar story, not a first, clumsy chapter. The question that froze her blood was not why. It was how long. How long? The words scraped past the shards of glass in her throat. His face crumpled. It is over. It was a madness, a sickness of the spirit. It is over now. We ended it. Today, that is what you saw, the end of it. Mary is going home. A new, colder tremor replaced the initial shock. The kiss was a goodbye. This wasn't an affair she had just caught in its first, fiery bloom. She had walked in on the final, desperate act of a long-running play. The betrayal had an entire history, a timeline of lies that existed parallel to every prayer, every meal, every shared night in their marriage bed. Her mind raced back 6 months, to when Jacob had started volunteering to drive Mary home from the Sunday singings, a 30-minute buggy ride through the dark. Then there was the hushed conversation at the quilting bee, the sudden silences when she entered a room. The evidence had been there, a trail of breadcrumbs she had been too trusting, too blind to follow. You will not speak of this, she said, her voice gaining a terrifying, preternatural calm. Not a word to anyone. You will tell the bishop that Mary was called home to help with a sickness. That is the story. Confusion warred with the shame on his face. Sarah, we must confess. We must go before the church and, Neen, the word was a blade. You will not take my shame and make it a spectacle for the whole district. You will not let them pity me and pray over my broken home while they gossip behind their hands. You have already stolen my marriage. You will not steal my dignity. You will sit in this house, you will eat at this table, and you will look me in the eye until I decide what is to be done. She held the iron plane so tightly her knuckles were bone white. The old Sarah, the quiet, agreeable wife, was gone, suffocated under the weight of this impossible truth. In her place stood a woman she did not recognize, a woman who would orchestrate her own survival. He flinched as if she had struck him. And Mary is no longer your concern, Sarah said, her voice hollow. She is my sister. Her punishment will be mine to give. The word sister felt like a mouthful of ashes. She turned her back on him, a dismissal more complete than any words, and walked slowly, deliberately up the wooden stairs. She passed the closed door to the guest room and could hear the muffled, rhythmic creak of the rocking chair and the sound of her sister's desperate, whispered prayers. She did not stop. She walked into her own bedroom, the room where her infant son, little Samuel, slept in his crib, his breath a soft, innocent whisper. She sat on the edge of the marriage bed, still holding Jacob's father's plane, and stared at the wall until the golden light faded and the room was swallowed by a starless country blackness. The first day of her new, fabricated life was over, and she had not shed a single tear. Dawn came, gray and indifferent. The routine of the farm, the insistent lowing of the cows, the crowing of the rooster, was a cruel mockery of normalcy. Sarah rose, dressed in a plain, charcoal-gray dress she usually reserved for funerals, and pinned her hair under her cap with sharp, angry movements. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty, but a pot of coffee had been made. A peace offering. She ignored it and walked out to the barn to help with the milking. The rhythmic thrum of the milk hitting the pail was the only sound between her and Jacob. He worked on one side of a Holstein, she on the other, the cow a massive, indifferent wall of flesh separating them. The silence was a living, breathing thing, more eloquent than any screaming match. It was a silence that spoke of a decade-long friendship, a courtship, a marriage, all of it reduced to this sterile, shared labor. As she finished her last cow, she heard the crunch of gravel. A buggy was coming up the lane. Jacob straightened, a flash of raw panic in his eyes. Sarah stood, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart a trapped bird. It was Mary's hired driver. Her sister came out of the house, a small, hunched figure carrying a single carpet bag. Her eyes were red-rimmed, looking bruised in the pale light. She paused at the edge of the barnyard, her gaze pleading, searching Sarah's face for a flicker of the sister she had known. Sarah stared back, her expression as blank and unyielding as the side of the barn. Mary flinched, ducked her head, and climbed into the buggy without a word. The driver clucked his tongue and the buggy rolled away, taking a piece of Sarah's past with it. That afternoon, a neighbor, Rebecca Lapp, stopped by with a loaf of friendship bread and a curious glint in her eye. "Saw Mary's buggy leaving early this morning," she said, her tone deceptively light. "Everything all right, Sarah, such a short visit." Sarah accepted the bread, her smile a flawless porcelain mask. "Everything's fine, Rebecca, denki. Ma'am just had a bad turn with her rheumatism." Mary had to get home right quick to help her. The lie was smooth as butter. It was the first of many bricks she would lay to build the wall that would protect her secret. She had never thought herself capable of such effortless deception, but a new instinct, fierce and primal, had taken root. The instinct to protect her son from a legacy of scandal, to preserve the only life she knew, even if the center of it was rotten. The days that followed took on a strange, formal rhythm. Sarah performed her duties with the precision of a machine. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the garden, she cared for Samuel. She spoke to Jacob only when necessary, her words brief and practical, delivered in a tone of cold courtesy. "Please pass the salt. The fence in the south pasture needs mending." He was a ghost at the edge of her vision, a silent, suffering giant who moved through his days like a man condemned. Every evening he would sit at the kitchen table, head bowed, while she prepared supper, his guilt a physical stain in the air. He was waiting for her to break, to scream, to accuse. Her calm was a punishment far more cruel. The lie about Mary's departure, a story Sarah had crafted to protect herself, began to mutate. It was a seed she didn't remember planting, watered by Jacob's guilt, that grew into a terrible, unforeseen weapon. One evening a week later, Jacob was late coming in from the fields. His plate was cold on the table. When he finally stepped inside, he wouldn't meet her eyes. His large frame seemed to have shrunk. He sat down and without preamble began to speak, his voice a low, wrecked murmur. "She is not well," he said, his gaze fixed on the uneaten food. "Mary, I saw her at the edge of the Miller farm today. She was walking, just walking along the fence line. She looked like a lost soul, Sarah, her eyes were empty." A cold needle of alarm pricked through Sarah's icy exterior. It was quickly replaced by a flare of contempt. "And is it your habit now to meet my sister at the edge of the Miller farm?" "Neen, neen," he said, shaking his head. "I was fixing the post. She was just there." "She said she has not slept. She has not eaten. The guilt is eating her alive." He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a confusing mix of pain and resentment. "Your lie, Sarah, saying she went home to help your ma'am. Her ma'am has been gone for 12 years. The whole community knows that now. They think she is losing her mind, that she is seeing things. They are calling her lecherich, touched in the head." The accusation, unspoken but clear, hung in the air. This was her doing. Her lie had created a new, public version of Mary. A woman unhinged, a teller of strange tales about a dead mother. Sarah had intended to manage the narrative, but the narrative had escaped her control and turned into a monster that was beginning to stalk her sister. A knot of icy dread tightened in her stomach. She had been so focused on her own performance, on controlling Jacob's shame, that she hadn't calculated the cost of her lie on Mary's already fragile state. Her strategy of stoic silence was not a fortress, but a pressure cooker, and the steam was escaping in the most dangerous of directions. The first crack in Sarah's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Sunday. They were at the Lapp farm for the bi-weekly church service, the long benches packed with the entire district. The familiar, mournful beauty of the Osbund hymns, sung in slow, unaccompanied German, filled the warm room. Sarah was holding Samuel, trying to find solace in the ancient words, when she saw Mary across the aisle. Her sister did look like a lost soul. Her cap was slightly askew, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the preacher's. But it wasn't Mary's vacant stare that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the way Jacob, sitting a rigid 2 feet away from her on the men's side, kept stealing glances at Mary. His expression was no longer just guilt. It was a deep, gnawing worry, a frantic concern so naked and raw that it was a public declaration in itself. It was a look he had not once directed at his own wife since that day. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. His heart, the heart he had supposedly given back to her with that final kiss, was still tethered to her sister, strung on a line of desperate pity and unresolved love. Anger, hot and blinding, finally burned through the ice. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of the first day. It was a jealous, humiliated rage. The next morning, while Jacob was hitching up the buggy to go to the lumber mill, she confronted him in the barn. "You will stop," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "Stop looking at her, stop feeling for her. The only thing you are permitted to feel is shame." He turned on her, his own temper, held in check for weeks, finally snapping. "And what would you have me do, Sarah? Wish her ill? She is sick. Your lie is destroying her. She goes around telling people her dead ma'am needs her, and they look at her with pity and fear. You are not punishing her, you are crucifying her in the court of public opinion, and you are using my sin as the hammer and nails." The accusation was so sharp, so unexpected, that it stole her breath. He wasn't just defending Mary, he was blaming her. He was twisting her survival mechanism into an act of cruelty. For the first time, a sliver of doubt worked its way under her righteous fury. Was that what she was doing? Was her dignified silence just a slow, public torture? She had wanted to control the story, but the story was now writing itself, painting her sister as a madwoman and her husband as a remorseful man trapped with a cold and calculating wife. The very narrative she'd tried to avoid, one of her as a pitiable victim, was being replaced by a far more sinister one of her own making. She needed to see it for herself. The next afternoon, she left Samuel with her mother-in-law, claiming a headache, and drove her own buggy down the winding lane to the small, neat farmhouse Mary shared with their widowed aunt. She found her sister in the garden, but there was no gardening being done. Mary was kneeling in the rows of turnips, not weeding, but sifting dry soil through her fingers, over and over, a blank, repetitive gesture. She looked up at the sound of the buggy, and her face crumpled into a mask of childish fear. She scrambled to her feet, backing away. "I'm not seeing things, Sarah," Mary said, her voice a frantic whisper. "She's not dead. Ma'am's not dead, I know she's not. I saw her just this morning by the well. She was wearing her blue dress." Tears were streaming down her hollow cheeks. The air left Sarah's lungs. It was far worse than she had imagined. The lie she'd told as a simple explanation, a bit of social mortar to seal a crack, had found a fertile ground in Mary's guilt-ridden, heartbroken mind. The story was no longer a story, it was a delusion. Mary was using the fictional illness of their mother, who had died in a buggy accident when they were girls, as a sanctuary from a reality where she had betrayed the person she loved most. Sarah's anger evaporated, replaced by a cold, horrifying clarity. She wasn't just punishing Mary, she was pushing her into a complete break from reality. Her own act of self-preservation was becoming a mortal sin. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her life had been upended. The silence was absolute. The iron handplane still sat on the high shelf, a bitter, cold monument. Jacob sat across from her, a man beaten down by more than just guilt. He was grieving for Mary, and he didn't even bother to hide it anymore. The gulf between them was an ocean of unspeakable pain. Sarah finally spoke, her voice stripped of all anger, leaving only a husk of exhaustion. "We have to bring Mary here." Jacob's head shot up, disbelief warring with a sudden, fragile hope. "What? She is sick, truly sick, and her sickness has my lie as its foundation. This isn't about you and me anymore. This is about her soul." The words tasted like surrender, like the demolition of the wall she had so carefully built. "She will come here, we will care for her, together. We will tell the bishop the truth, but a partial truth. We will say we do not know the reason for her break with reality, but that the stress of a private shame she would not share has broken her mind. We will not speak of the affair. That secret stays buried. But we will create a new truth for the community, a truth of family duty and Christian care. It is the only way to bring her back from wherever she has gone. Her mind is paying the price for our sin, and that debt falls on us both. Jacob stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. The cold, calculating stranger was gone, replaced by a woman of terrifying strength and pragmatic grace. A woman willing to live under the same roof with her betrayer and her husband, all to save her sister from madness. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't love. It was a radical, soul-scouring act of duty that left no room for her own healing. He nodded slowly, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. "Yeah," he whispered hoarsely. "Yeah, it is right." The arrival of Mary was a quiet, heartbreaking affair. She came willingly, like a child, clinging to Sarah's arm. She seemed to have no memory of the event that had broken her, the kiss in the workshop now buried under a deluge of delusion. She talked endlessly of their mother, of recipes and forgotten songs, her mind a skipping record stuck in a time before her fall. Sarah moved her into the downstairs sewing room, turning it into a sick room. She bathed her, brushed her hair, and spoke to her in the soft, lilting tones of their childhood. The days transformed into a fragile, heartbreaking rhythm. Jacob was a silent, gentle presence, doing the heavy chores without complaint, his eyes always tracking Mary with a look of sorrowful devotion that he was too exhausted to mask. Sarah saw it all. She saw the way his hand would hover near Mary's back as he guided her to the table, the anguish in his eyes when she called him deed. She was a nurse in a house of ghosts, tending to her sister's shattered mind while living in the graveyard of her own marriage. Her love for Jacob, she realized, had not died that day in the workshop. It had been transmuted into something else, a heavy, cold stone of shared responsibility and silent, enduring pain. They were no longer husband and wife, they were custodians of a secret, co-authors of a tragedy. A month passed. The bishop and the deacons were informed of the sanitized version of the story, and a great wave of community support washed over the farm. Casseroles appeared. Men came to help with the plowing. They were held up as models of Christ-like charity. Sarah accepted the praise with a numb smile. The dissonance between the saintly picture the community saw and the infernal truth of their home was a scream only she could hear. One evening, as the first hard frost painted the window panes, a breakthrough came. Sarah was reading aloud from the Bible the story of the prodigal son. Mary, who had been placidly rocking, suddenly stilled. Her eyes, for the first time in weeks, cleared. The fog lifted, revealing a stark, horrified sanity. She looked from Sarah's tired face to Jacob's grieving one, and the entire, monstrous weight of memory crashed down on her. She remembered the workshop, the kiss, the confession, and she saw the evidence of her own madness, the sick room, the caretaking, the infinite crushing compassion of the sister she had ruined. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. "Oh, Sarah, what have I done? What have I done to you?" She slid from the chair to the floor, prostrate, clawing at the rag rug with her fingers. "Leave me. Let me go back. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your kindness. I'm a Judas." Sarah knelt beside her, the Bible thudding to the floor. She pulled Mary's head into her lap, cradling her the way she cradled Samuel. The tears that Sarah had not shed for weeks finally came, a hot, silent torrent that soaked Mary's hair. All the strategy, all the control dissolved in that moment of raw, shared grief. "We are beyond deserving, sister," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "We are all the way past it. There is only going on now, there is only this." Jacob watched from the doorway, a monumental figure of shame and awe. He saw the two women, the sisters he had torn apart and bound together forever in a new, terrible way. His sin was no longer the center of the story. Their bond, broken and painstakingly mended, was now the only thing holding the fragile piece together. He was not part of it. He was the cause of it. He was an outsider in his own home, a living, breathing reminder of the destruction they were trying to rise from. The revelation was a death sentence for any hope of a restored marriage. The second truth came out 2 nights later, a final shard of the broken mirror Sarah had been holding. Samuel was running a fever, and Sarah was up with him in the still, dark hours of the early morning. After he finally fell asleep, she went downstairs to make a poultice and heard low voices from Mary's room. The door was open a crack. Jacob was sitting on a stool near the bed, his head bowed. Mary was speaking, her voice a weak whisper, but in the silent house, every word was clear. "I want to make my kneeling confession before the whole church," Mary was saying. "I want to tell them all. It is the only way my soul can find rest. The lie is a stone on my chest." Sarah's breath caught. A public confession would annihilate everything. It would turn their family into the worst kind of scandal, one involving not just adultery but now a cover-up and a descent into madness. Samuel would grow up in the shadow of it. Jacob's reply was a desperate whisper. "Neen, Mary, we swore. We gave our word to Sarah. It would destroy her. It would destroy the boy's life." "I know," Mary wept. "And that is my punishment, to live with the sin and be seen as the madwoman who saw her dead mother. Sarah has chosen my cross for me, and I must carry it." There it was. Sarah stood frozen in the dark hallway, the final, brutal truth of her own design. She had not chosen a path of mercy, she had devised a perfect, lifelong punishment for them all. They were all bound together in a silent, gilded cage of her making. Mary would be forever the eccentric, pitiable woman redeemed by her family's charity. Jacob would be the devoted husband caring for his broken sister-in-law. And Sarah would be the saintly wife, a role she had to play every single day until death, married to a man whose touch she could no longer bear, and living with a sister who had become a living monument to her pain. Their survival was a life sentence with no possibility of parole, a punishment far more exquisite than any shunning the church could offer. Spring came, a slow, reluctant thawing of the earth. The farm was a model of order and quiet. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets snapping in a brisk, clean wind. Mary was sitting on the porch, shelling peas, her movements calm and measured. She was better, anchored to reality by the very routine that was a cage. The hallucinations had stopped, but a deep, permanent sadness had settled in her eyes, an acceptance of her purgatory. Jacob was in the workshop. The rhythmic scrape of his plane was once again a constant sound, but it no longer meant provision or peace. It was a metronome counting out the beats of their shared exile. Sarah watched a robin pull a worm from the damp soil. Her heart was a landscape of cold ashes, but a new, unexpected clarity was settling over her. It wasn't forgiveness. It would never be forgiveness. It was a recognition of what was. Her husband's heart had strayed, and while his body remained, the man she had married was dead. Her sister had shattered a lifelong trust, and in return had been given a mind full of ghosts. Sarah herself had become a master of deception, a chief architect of a beautiful, tragic lie. They were all guilty, all victims, all prisoners. The bond between them was no longer love, but a shared, unutterable secret, a weight they would carry to their graves. Jacob stepped out of the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw her by the line, the sun catching the silver threads now appearing in her hair. He didn't smile. He just looked at her, a long, searching look. He was looking for a sign, any sign that the wall of ice had a door in it. Sarah held his gaze. She did not feel the old love, and she no longer felt the sharp, hot hatred. She felt the heavy, smooth weight of their history of her choice like the iron plane sitting on the shelf. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not a nod of welcome or of reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement of the pact they had all made, the terrible, silent, and unbreakable agreement to carry on. She picked up the basket of wet clothes and turned back toward the house, toward her sister, toward the long, quiet, carefully scripted drama of the rest of her life. The story was over, but the living of it had just begun, played out one silent, dutiful day at a time on a farm that held more secrets than the land could ever hold corn.